For several days in Agua Azul, the same question kept coming up among those who knew Denise Barrera. What had happened that night? The first answers didn't come right away. They emerged little by little through testimonies, records, and small details that, at first, seemed unrelated. The investigation moved forward by reconstructing each of her last movements, following a path that took her from a public event to a point where there were no longer any witnesses. And it was through that process, step by step, that authorities managed to identify the person who was with her in her final hours. The case of Denise Barrera. Every day we live alongside evil. We witness the darkest side of human behavior. The suffering caused by one individual to others is a constant presence in our society. On Criminal Investigators, we will delve into that dark side of humanity. We will bring the most perverse crimes to the screen and try to get inside the minds of those beings who commit the most terrible acts. I'm Alex, and today I bring you another case. But before we begin, I want you to tell me where you're watching us from. We really like to know how far these stories reach. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share this video if you think someone else might be interested. And now, let's begin. The morning of March 19, 2017, started like any other in Agua Azul, in the department of Casanare, Colombia. A married couple was walking along a road near a sector when something on the path caught their attention. They were small bloodstains on the asphalt. At first, they thought it might be a run-over animal, which is relatively common in that area. But as they advanced a few meters, the scene changed completely. On the side of the road, among the vegetation, lay the body of a woman. They were small bloodstains on the asphalt. At first they thought it might be a run-over animal, which is relatively common in that area. But as they advanced a few meters, the scene changed completely. On the side of the road, among the vegetation, lay the body of a woman. The position she was in and the state she was found in made it clear that this was no accident. They immediately notified the authorities. Minutes later, police units arrived at the scene and cordoned off the area, while some neighbors began to gather in the distance, still not understanding the magnitude of what had just occurred. That was the starting point of an investigation that, at that moment, was just beginning. With the area secured, the forensics team began the inspection work. At first glance, the body showed multiple wounds caused by a sharp object, concentrated mainly on the torso and neck. The victim was lying on her back, with her head turned to one side and her legs spread, in a position that did not seem natural or accidental. The way she was positioned, along with her clothes completely torn from neck to ankle, suggested more than just a violent attack. There was a clear intent of exposure. It wasn't just about taking her life, but leaving the body in a degrading condition. That detail began to shape one of the first lines of analysis. The attacker didn't just act with violence, but with intense emotional charge. After the body was recovered and taken to forensics, the experts confirmed the magnitude of the attack. The victim had received more than 20 wounds, many of them unnecessary to cause death. To this was added another key element: signs of an intimate attack. With those first findings, the investigation began to take a clear direction, though still without a defined face. While the experts worked on analyzing the body, the first rumors began to circulate in the municipality. The news of the discovery spread quickly, and almost at the same time a name emerged, that of a woman who had not returned home the night before. One of her sisters went to the house and found the youngest son completely alone. The boy confirmed that his mother had not come back to sleep that night. That information raised alarms, just as images of the body found on the road began to spread in parallel. Identification soon became inevitable. The clothes matched. Hours later, through fingerprints and confirmation from her family, authorities officially established the victim's identity. It was Denise Barrera, a 32-year-old woman. The investigation stopped being an unidentified case and shifted to reconstructing what had happened during her final hours alive. Investigators began to reconstruct the victim's profile. Edeniz Barrera was 32 years old, a mother of two, and worked as a kitchen assistant. Additionally, she volunteered for the civil defense, an activity that made her well known in the community for her willingness to help others. Those around her described her as warm, supportive, and resilient. She had grown up in a difficult context, raised by her mother alongside several siblings, in a home where there wasn't always stability. Despite that, she had managed to get ahead and become the main provider for her family. However, other nuances also began to appear. According to some testimonies, she led an active social life, went out frequently, and liked to hang out with friends. That lifestyle had caused some friction within her family. For investigators, these details were significant. Understanding how Edeniz lived, who she associated with, and her personal dynamics was key to narrowing down her close circle and, with that, reducing the number of potential suspects. With the victim's profile clearer, investigators moved on to reconstructing her final hours alive. The first clue led them to the district of San Jose del Bubuy, where patron saint festivities were being celebrated that night. Several people confirmed that Edeniz had been there, hanging out with friends and drinking alcohol. At that point, the investigation didn't have a defined line yet, but it did have a key piece of data. Edeniz hadn't disappeared in an isolated place, but in a public setting surrounded by people. That opened up the possibility of multiple witnesses. However, it also complicated the picture, as it meant reviewing dozens of accounts to find reliable matches. Officers began interviewing those who were at the event, trying to establish what time she was last seen, what state she was in, and above all, who she was with. The answers were still scattered, but they agreed on one thing. At some point in the early morning, Edeniz was no longer alone, and that detail began to shape the next stage of the investigation. In parallel to reconstructing her final hours, investigators turned their attention to Edeniz's closest circle. As usually happens in these types of cases, the first line of analysis focused on her partner, Oscar Medina, with whom she was living at the time of the events. From the start, his behavior drew attention. Those who saw him after the news broke described him as distant, not very affected by what had happened. But there was an even more significant detail. Just a few hours after the body was found, Oscar packed his things and left the house he shared with Edeniz, without giving any clear explanation. That move raised alarms. For investigators, it was not a typical reaction. Added to this, family and close friends began to express doubts about his attitude, pointing out that something didn't fit. Oscar packed his things and left the house he shared with Edeniz, without giving any clear explanation. That move raised alarms. For investigators, it was not a typical reaction. Added to this, family and close friends began to express doubts about his attitude, pointing out that something didn't fit. With those elements, the police quickly identified him as the main suspect in this first stage of the investigation, while they prepared to take his statement and compare his version with the facts known up to that point. When Oscar was called in to testify, investigators wanted to compare his behavior with a clear version of the events. According to his testimony, on March 18th, he had returned to the house around 6 in the evening, and Edeniz was already gone. He claimed that he stayed home that night with the youngest son and didn't see her again. He also explained that he had been drinking since early on and decided not to go out. However, his story didn't completely clear up the doubts. For investigators, there was a possibility that he had gone out during the night and returned before dawn, without the child noticing. Furthermore, his decision to leave the house just hours after the body was found remained a difficult point to justify. Although his version didn't have obvious contradictions, it wasn't completely solid either. At that moment, the investigation still revolved around him, but objective elements were still needed to confirm or rule out his involvement. While Oscar's version was being analyzed, investigators continued with interviews at the place where Edeniz was last seen. That was when a testimony emerged that would change the course of the case. A woman who worked in the Coliseum restrooms during the festivities recalled an important detail. In the early morning, around 3, Edeniz had arrived at the place intoxicated, but she wasn't alone. She was accompanied by a man, and he was the one who paid for entry. The witness claimed to recognize him. It was a young man known in the community named Dimaripus Medina, a man who also participated in civil defense activities. That information was key because it not only confirmed that Edenice was with someone in her final hours, but it also put a specific name on the table. With this new information, the investigation stopped focusing exclusively on the partner and opened up a second line. For the first time, investigators had a person who had been with the victim shortly before her death, and that automatically made him a central point in the case. With that new name in the investigation, officers began to reconstruct Edenice's movements during the early morning with greater precision. Several people confirmed seeing her with this man in the hours after the festivities, around 3 in the morning. The next step was to look for objective evidence to back up those testimonies. Security cameras located near a police station provided a key element. The images showed a couple matching the descriptions, him and her talking briefly before getting onto a motorcycle. Although the quality of the recordings didn't allow for clear identification of the faces, the clothing, build, and sequence of events matched what the witnesses had stated. The images showed both of them heading towards Agua Azul, moving away from the location. That recording marked a critical point in the investigation. It was the last time Edenice was seen alive. From that moment on, everything indicated that what happened next had no witnesses, and investigators' attention began to focus more and more on the person riding that motorcycle. While analyzing the images and testimonies, investigators added a new element to the reconstruction, the call history from the woman's phone. That was when a decisive piece of data appeared. Before we continue, you should make a quick break. If not investigate documentaries on email to Scrabble, pretty money like. That really helps us to keep making more videos and telling these kinds of true stories. That said, now let's continue with the story. At 3:15 in the morning, Edenice made a call to a close friend. In that brief conversation, she asked him to come pick her up, explaining that she had had an argument and was alone in San Jose del Bubui. Her tone, according to the testimony, wasn't panicked, but it did show she had been drinking. However, there was a detail that particularly caught their attention. During the call, the man managed to hear another voice in the background. That contradicted the idea that Edenice was alone at that moment. The witness told her he would go get her, but he didn't do it right away. He turned off his phone for several minutes. When he tried to call back, Edenice's phone was no longer active. For investigators, that window of time became critical. Everything indicated that the attack occurred shortly after that call. Little by little, the elements that initially placed him as the main suspect began to lose weight. His behavior was still questionable, but there was no longer concrete evidence directly linking him to the crime. With that information, the investigation took a turn. Attention shifted away from the partner and moved almost entirely to Dimaripus, who had been seen with Edenice in her final hours. From that moment on, all lines of work began to point in a single direction. With the seized items under analysis, investigators entered the most decisive stage of the case. The clothing, though apparently clean, was subjected to tests with special reagents. That's how traces not visible to the naked eye began to appear. On the motorcycle, specifically on one of the footrests, experts detected a stain that proved key. The analysis confirmed it was Edenice's blood. That finding completely shattered the suspect's version, who claimed to have parted ways with her without anything happening. But that wasn't the only proof. During the autopsy, forensic doctors had found biological remains under the victim's fingernails, a clear sign that she had tried to defend herself. When comparing that material with samples taken from the suspect, the result was conclusive. They matched. For investigators, this finalized the reconstruction. Edenice had not only been with him in her final hours, but she had also fought her attacker. And that evidence, impossible to explain any other way, placed him directly at the scene of the attack. With all the evidence gathered, the prosecution moved quickly. The scientific evidence, combined with testimonies and visual records, was enough to request an arrest warrant. Days later, the suspect was detained on a public street in the municipality's main park. The procedure did not go unnoticed. The news had already spread throughout the community, and dozens of people began to gather at the scene. The outrage was obvious. What until recently was uncertainty now had a concrete face. The transfer to the courthouse became a tense moment. The police presence had to be reinforced to prevent the situation from escalating. Social pressure was high, with demands for immediate justice. From that moment on, the case left the investigative phase to enter the judicial arena, where the evidence had to hold up before a judge. During the hearings, the prosecution presented each of the elements collected throughout the investigation in an orderly manner. The camera footage, the testimonies placing De Meripus with Edenise in her final hours, and, above all, the scientific evidence, built a clear timeline of what happened. The DNA analysis was one of the most compelling points. The match between the and the defendant's samples was hard to refute. Added to that were the blood traces found on the motorcycle and on his belongings. Faced with that scenario, and with the evidence against him completely solid, the accused ended up admitting his responsibility. However, he never offered a clear explanation of what happened or the motive behind the attack. For the prosecution, the case pointed to an ambiguous relationship in which rejection by Edenise would have triggered a violent reaction. With responsibility acknowledged and the evidence fully presented, the process moved toward its resolution. Months after the crime, the court issued its final decision. De Meripus Medina was sentenced to 390 months in prison, meaning more than 32 years, for the crime of aggravated femicide. The sentence reflected not only the severity of the events, but also the extreme violence with which the crime was committed. For the justice system, it had been proven that this was not an isolated or circumstantial event, but an attack with a disproportionate level of violence. The way Edenise was found, the wounds, and the context in which everything occurred were decisive in establishing the classification of the crime. After the sentence, the case was closed in court, but not for Edenise's family. Her absence left a deep void, especially for her children, who lost the person who supported their home. Her sister was one of the strongest voices throughout the process. In her statements, she remembered Edenise as a woman who, despite the difficulties, managed to get ahead for her children and always be there for those around her. For her, what happened didn't just take a life, but tore a whole family apart. She also took the opportunity to leave a clear message for other women who might be going through similar situations. She urged them not to stay silent, to seek help in time, and not to normalize environments where fear exists. A message that, beyond this case, reflects a reality that keeps repeating itself. And well, dear audience, that's it for another investigation. What do you think of today's case? We'd love to read your comments, as your opinion on these cases is very important to us. Please remember to always do so with the utmost respect, both for the victim and for other viewers, and we'll be reading them. Before you go, leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Also, don't forget to share this video if you think someone you know might be interested. See you in another criminal investigation. Goodbye.